Welcome to The Forest Garden, a podcast for gardeners who want to upgrade their landscapes into biodiverse food forest systems. On today's episode of The Forest Garden, we will be talking to Kyle Dougherty, a good friend of Ben and myself who really surpasses us in terms of unusual plant knowledge. Kyle takes collecting and cultivating rare edible plants to the next level, and has a specific interest in edibles from East Asia. So on today's episode, tune in to learn about 10 plants from East Asia that you likely have never heard of. Today we have a really exciting episode for you covering perennial vegetables and woody plants from East Asia. But before we get into that, why don't we get to know our guest a little bit? How did you get introduced to the world of unusual edibles, Kyle?
It's kind of a long story. When I first bought my house like 5 years ago, I was thinking like, oh, I would like to have a forest type environment in the yard, but I also want to grow food. So I typed into Google like edible forest garden and found the book of that name and read the entire thing. And I've been kind of growing unusual woody and perennial crops ever since. So it's been like a 5-year journey. In the last 2 years, I've been interested in unusual plants from East Asia. And today I'm going to be talking about 10 of them.
And we were talking a little bit about before the show why East Asian plants might be a suitable analog for our environment. I say "are" on the East Coast, but I'm no longer an East Coaster. I'm a West Coaster now. And it sounded like the climate in certain parts of East Asia matches roughly with some of the parts of the climate and the conditions of certain parts of the US. Is that right?
Yeah, so South Korea and northern Japan are pretty analogous to the northeastern US. And then parts of China and southern Japan kind of have similarities to the southeast mid-Atlantic region. So there are plants from East Asia that will grow basically anywhere in the United States. Some of them like it warmer, some of them like it cooler. But it's a rich region with a long history of foraging and eating wild plants that we can tap into.
And going back to some of the original, even non-edible plants like ornamentals that are super popular in the US, like Kusa dogwood or whatever, were all discovered by mostly white males who went over to Asia and just didn't really abide by any of sort of the rules or regulations that we have today about importing plants. By the time, went there and found some of the most amazing plants, some of the most ornamental, beautiful, edible, etc. plants that are considered quote unquote exotics. This history is important just to note sort of the long relationship that the United States has had with East Asia. 200 years of plant explorers, or 200 years ago, plant explorers going over and taking these plants and bringing them that care. They didn't just appear here. A lot of the plants that we'll talk about today were originally brought over as potential ornamentals and may have not been valued for their edible properties, or they were. And Americans just didn't really have the generational history of foraging to completely comprehend the edible qualities of these plants. So it's kind of a complicated history that we could have a whole episode on, just that alone, about plant explorers and some of the things they did and whether or not they were ethically okay, etc. But today we're mostly going to be talking about the plants themselves and how they can exist in a forest garden context today.
There's a good book called The Food Explorer, I think. I got it on audiobook that talks about David Fairchild in particular.
Yeah, Fairchild is definitely one of them. And is it the Meyer lemon? I remember you posting something about this, Ben, but the Meyer lemon being discovered as just like an ornamental that was Frank Meyer just sort of like stumbling through somebody's yard and going, oh, this looks like an interesting citrus, and then like bringing it back.
Yeah, I mean, that's the story. And every story like that, especially in the plant world, is probably half truth, but at least it makes for a good story. And I think, I don't remember all of it, but yeah, it was, he was exploring parts of East Asia. Yeah, just sort of just stumbling across sometimes just wild seedling trees that have were popping up randomly. Sometimes there was on people's farms or yards that he was taking cuttings and seeds from and bringing it back to the U.S., much to the chagrin of the plant pathologists. So I think they were kind of at odds because they wanted to make sure that everything that came into the country was completely free of any pathogen and any pest. And meanwhile, you have like a shipment of like 1,000 different bits and pieces of plants that are coming in, and sometimes they would detect a pathogen or a pest and just burn the entire shipment. And Frank Meyer or David Fairchild would be like, "Well, I guess that's a year of work down the toilet, or up in flames, really." So I guess that's how it works. But for better or worse, we have them here.
Yeah.
So maybe we should get into it. Kyle, do you want to maybe start talking about the first plant that you?
Yeah. So I'm going to be talking about 10 plants today. So every plant that I'm talking about today, I've grown myself and I've tasted the edible parts of. I live in Connecticut and my growing zone is 6B. So all of these plants can grow in that zone. And I've ordered them from, I guess I would say, most useful to most weird. So we're going to start with one that a lot of people have probably heard of in permaculture circles, which is Tuna sinensis, the Chinese tune. It's a hardy deciduous tree from China that can grow eventually to like 80 feet tall, but usually much, much less. It looks sort of like a tree of heaven or a sumac. The young leaves of the tree are very, very tasty, with a taste that I would kind of describe it as chicken soup flavor or like beef and onions. I know Mike's tasted it before, so I wonder what you would say about the flavor of Tuna sinensis.
Well, I've tasted it, and yeah, I would agree with you. It kind of has like a bouillon broth,
Yeah, like
almost
like
like
a vegetable stock or like a chicken stock.
yeah, it's very savory. I believe the leaves are very high in nutrients as well.
Yeah,
One of the
actually,
nice properties of the tree leaves family.
it's considered one of the most nutritious vegetables like on earth because being a tree, it has a larger root system with which to pull nutrients from the soil. And yeah, the leaves are like a lot of people will say you can eat them raw, and that's fine. But typically in East Asia, in China and in Japan and Korea, they're always cooked. So either like lightly boiled or made into some kind of tempura. And I can say the flavor is a little better when cooked than raw.
I've even seen them. I was really surprised in a Asian grocery store. I saw a instant ramen noodle packet, but the flavor was
Tuna
like
flavor.
beef, chicken, mushroom, and then there was a tuna flavor. And so
Wow.
I bought that one up.
Well, did it taste good? Did you try it?
Yeah, it was great. I mean, I'm a vegetarian, so anything that I can get that has that same sort of meaty, flavor to it, that replacement is always kind of nice to have.
Yeah, I read an article a couple of years ago that tune leaves in markets in China actually sell for more than like beef because they're just
Wow.
highly sought after, and they have like the peak season is right in the spring when the leaves first emerge. So, they don't stock them all year round, but if you grow a tree, you can harvest the spring shoots and you can also harvest any new growth throughout the year. So it's not just not just a spring vegetable.
So where can it grow?
So it can grow in zones 5 and up, and it likes full sun to part shade. As I mentioned at the top, it can get to be like 80 feet tall, and I've seen a specimen at the Arnold Arboretum in Boston, which is 80 feet tall, growing like in a woodland. But if you're going to harvest young leaves, you really want to cut it like 4 to 6 feet tall, coppice it every year or two, just to keep everything within reach. And the plant suckers pretty vigorously. So that just means more to harvest from because more stems means more leaves. And I would also recommend growing the variety Flamingo, which has bright, bright pink leaves in the spring. It was selected as an ornamental. It also probably has better tasting leaves than some of the seedling ones because in China, the wisdom is that tune with green leaves doesn't taste good and tune with pink leaves does taste good.
Whoa, that's interesting. Yeah, I'm more familiar with the green leaf type. I've grown that one before. It almost looks like sumac, like little sumac shrubs or walnut shrubs. It kind of has that leaf pattern to it. Those are the only ones that I've seen. I got those from eBay. But I thought when I hear ornamental, usually I hear that it's probably not good for eating. But it sounds like in this case, it's the opposite. They're even better.
Yeah, it's really quite stunning, but it's stunning for maybe like 3 weeks in the spring. So like it's almost like a back of the border type of plant because the rest of the year it doesn't really stand out too much. But it does give this really intense pop of pink in the spring that really people comment about it because they're really surprised.
Like a giant pink lollipop sumac almost. And it's funny, Ben, you gifted me a tuna sinensis. I guess for listeners, Ben and I communicated for the first time ever, sort of by accident, communicating about permaculture. And the first thing he ever gave me was a tune tree. And then a few months later, I encountered Kyle also through the same sort of accidental permaculture, and he also gifted me a tune tree. So this seems to be the one that he gave me. He gave me the flamingo variety, and both of them are doing pretty good in my landscape. And it just seems like this is the sort of plant nerd tree of peace and commerce, and like it's
I love it.
why is it that the tune
The rite of
brought it,
passage.
yeah, exactly. It's the rite of passage of the permaculture nerds. We all came together through the Chinese tune. And it's also the tree in my landscape that everybody sort of reacts to and loves the most, I would say, because when you pick a tiny little leaflet or compound leaf, whatever, off of the tree and give it to someone, and then they're like, whoa, it tastes like bouillon. Like, what is this? Like, onion flavors are maybe not super valued in Western society, but the more that you start to like delve into them, into the backyard food forest, like I feel like, I don't know, it becomes more and more exciting over time.
Yeah, the story behind that one that I gave to Mike is that I had ordered a plant at great expense online, and I had it delivered, and it was very small. And then a few days later, I went to my local nursery, and there was a huge plant there. And I was like, well, I'm not going to not buy the big one. So I ended up having a big one and a little one, and I gave Mike the smaller one as I only have room for one in my small yard. So the next plant is, funny enough, also has a kind of meaty flavor to it. And this is one that really, I would say only like 3 people that I've spoken to actually have heard of this plant. So this is a deep cut. And it's Staphylia bumalda, or the Bumald's bladdernut. It doesn't really even have a common name. And it's a multi-stemmed deciduous shrub that grows about 6 feet high and wide. And it has small leaves in threes. And the young leaves and flower buds are edible in the spring. And the flavor, to my taste, it tastes just like sesame oil, which is like kind of oddly specific. Like if you go to a Chinese food restaurant and they cook the food in sesame oil, it has that flavor. It's one of the bladdernuts, which grow all around the world. It's the smallest, being only 6 feet tall, but that just makes it the best for harvesting the young leaves and flower buds. In rural China, it's actually like the most popular wild foraged plant, and they call it tree cauliflower because the young flower buds are harvested just like a little cauliflower on a tree.
Is it only harvestable in the spring then? Is it a spring foraged vegetable?
So it is mainly harvested in the spring. So what the Chinese do in the rural mountainous regions is they harvest a whole ton of it in the spring, the leaves and the flower buds, and they actually sun dry it and then put it into storage. And apparently it rehydrates very well during cooking after sun drying.
And Kyle, could you say the name of this type of bladdernut one more time? I heard what you said, and I'm trying to look into it myself.
So this is Staphylia bumalda. So it's Bumalda. It really has a lot going for it. It's actually one of the studies of food use in rural China puts it as more popular than tune as a vegetable. Like more people knew about it and ate it than tune. It's also shade tolerant. It can grow in shade or sun as long as the soil is reasonably moist. It's also possible, I should mention that I mean it's one of many Staphylia species, and it's also probable that all of them are edible in this same way, but this one is just the most preferred. The flowers on this species in particular, they're very like the flower stalk is very short, while like the other species, the flower stalk can be like 4 inches long. So when you like pluck it off, it's more beneficial to have it shorter, and then it makes like a more compact vegetable, I guess.
And you said this is a commonly foraged plant, so it's wild, and there probably hasn't been a lot of domestication or improvement done on it.
No, there hasn't been a lot, like there hasn't been any improvement done on it. It's foraged in China and Korea and parts of Japan. And in China, there's actually a tourist industry where people are visiting rural areas from the big cities so that they can taste this delicious, healthy spring vegetable. They're actually planting whole orchards of this plant.
I really want to try it. It sounds delicious.
And so is this something that you've actually been able to source in the US, or is this mostly something that is, accessed from more of a research perspective?
So I've tasted it, it's delicious, and I have collected seed from botanical gardens to grow my own. So that's Staphylia Bumald's blatternut. Like I said before, there are several species of bladdernuts, and the Japanese certainly believe that all of them are edible. All of them have edible leaves with a similar flavor. I have yet to try like the native American species, Staphylia trifolia, but I've tried some of the other Asian species and they do basically taste the same, but they're larger trees, so they're harder to fit into like a understory situation. One in particular I would mention is Staphylia holocarpa rosea, which has pink flowers, so it's just prettier.
One last question on that one. Are any of the other this one or any of the bladdernuts, with just a name like bladdernut, I think about the seed and the edibility of the seed. Does this one have an edible seed? And is that common for most other bladdernuts too?
So Staphylia bumalda has a seed that is very, very small, like smaller than a lentil. So it's not really worth shelling at that size. But some of the other species do have nuts that are larger and are worth eating. The European bladdernut is eaten sometimes, and it's almost like a pistachio, like a small pistachio. It's very difficult to crack, and that's usually the biggest problem with growing them as a nut tree.
This is all new to me. I mean, bladdernuts, I don't know. I feel like most of the people who listen to this podcast this will be the first time that they've ever considered bladdernut in their landscape. So we are very thankful for your knowledge, Kyle. Let's move on to the next plant. This is really exciting and interesting.
So the next one on the list, and this is going to be a weird Latin name, Eleutherococcus siboldianus, or five-leaf Aurelia. Now this one is a thorny deciduous shrub with small leaves in fives, and it's an extremely durable plant. Tolerates full shade, full sun, poor dry soils, and it's even hardy to zone 4. And this plant has leaves that are edible cooked with a bittersweet flavor. Every time I bring this plant up, it's like, describe the flavor better. It's literally 50% sweet and 50% bitter. It's traditionally grown in parts of Japan as an edible hedge. They pluck the little leaves off, you boil them and mix them with rice to give like a nice herbal flavor to the rice, or they chop them up with miso and walnuts to make an ohitashi, which is like a traditional Japanese vegetable side dish. And it's even grown commercially, and they use it for various value-added products because it's a member of the ginseng family, and so it has some medicinal qualities too.
So some people who listen to this podcast might be familiar with the genus, Eleuthero, or I don't even really know how to pronounce it. Eleuthero. The thing to me, when we first started talking about this, that was so exciting is that this is the first edible hedge I'd ever heard about. And you sent me some really amazing research that had been done 100 years ago from the college that I go to now, which is UMass. And William Clark and some of the other like early plant explorers had been doing hedge trials with this plant and in their hedge area of the Massachusetts Agricultural College. And it's uncertain whether or not it was ever really even considered to be an edible hedge in the United States. But what you're saying is that in Japan, it's cultivated as a hedge and also as an edible.
Yeah, so in the city of Yonezawa, Japan, during feudal times, the shogun of that city actually, like, this is a plant from China. It does not actually occur in Japan. The shogun of that city in Japan, he imported this plant specifically to be used as an edible hedge. So the idea was, because it's kind of thorny, you could plant it around your property and it'll prevent people from invading your property. But if a famine strikes, you can go and you can cut off all the leaves and now you have something to eat. So in that city, Yonezawa, they have maintained this tradition to this day, and they still actively plant this as an edible hedge. It's a pretty good hedge because it has small leaves, so it has a nice effect. And the leaves actually, despite it being deciduous, the leaves actually stay bright green until December. So it has an almost evergreen look to it.
I think it's kind of amazing that it tolerates full shade, and I'm also seems like it also, from what I'm seeing here, tolerates full sun. That those are kind of few and far between. So in a forest garden setting, I'm imagining a 80-foot tall tuna tree with a 8-foot tall Aurelia tree underneath it that's able to tolerate the full shade but still produce food. I think that's really impressive.
Yeah, it's extremely versatile. There's even for like ornamental purposes, there's even a variegated form that's actually probably the most commonly available form. Like the straight species with green leaves is not commonly available anymore, but the variegated form is still out there and being sold, and it tastes the same. It has a very nice look in the landscape.
So when you say sweet and bitter, I'm imagining like eating a stevia leaf. Is it kind of similar to that? Maybe not quite as sweet, but that sort of balance of sweet and bitter.
Yeah, I would say like the bitter is a little bit later than the sweet. Like when you first eat it, you're like, oh, this is a green vegetable, like a nice green vegetable. But then like you get a little hint, like a little glow of bitterness at the end.
I see. Okay.
So I tried this 5-leaf Aurelia for the first time ever today. And what I would compare the flavor to is sort of like sort of the classic vegetal taste of lots of perennial vegetables. But for whatever reason, I had the sort of pull of some of the more celery flavored things. Maybe that was because we tried Oenanthe like only 15 minutes before, but I'm not really sure. And then after a minute or two of chewing, then the sort of bitter notes clock in at the end. But this is entirely when you're eating it raw. So when you cook it, Kyle, doesn't it sort of have an entirely different flavor profile?
Yeah, the flavor definitely improves when it's cooked because the bitterness is caused by saponins, and saponins are water soluble. So if you boil it, then you get a lot of that bitter flavor out of it, and it tastes a lot better.
That's true of most perennial vegetables. I feel like lots of perennial vegetables have saponins or off flavors or whatever. And I'm just imagining at my grandparents' house, they planted hedges that were thorny and invasive, quote unquote, invasive plants from Asia that didn't have edible qualities. So like, imagine if Berberis thunbergi had just been completely ignored because it was probably discovered by the same people. And instead they had planted 5-leaf Aurelia. We all would probably be the better for it. I mean, especially in the times that we're in where food security is so much more important. It's just something that an edible hedge really kind of comes in clutch, I guess, or could come in clutch in the future.
2 points I want to hit on that subject before we move on to the next one. So 5-leaf Aurelia can be invasive. It's a dioecious plant, so there's male and females, and all of the plants in the United States are female. So it can't spread by seed, but it spreads by arching and touching the ground like a blackberry. And I'm not 100% sure, but I think it can also spread by suckering because, I mean, all the plants I've grown only sucker around the base, but I've seen it take over parts of woodlands. So the main thing with this plant is don't leave it unattended. Don't put it in your local woodland and then, I don't know, just leave. If you're gonna harvest it, you're gonna cut it. So it's kind of like harvesting is the best practice. I've seen it kept as a hedge 3 feet tall and 1 foot wide, which is very small. And I'm actually growing my own hedge about that size. So basically just keep it in check by eating it.
Very cool.
Next up, I have Dioscorea polystachya, the Chinese yam. Now, this one is a little bit more popular than some of the others, too. So this is a vigorous twining vine up to 15 feet long with heart-shaped leaves, and it produces aerial tubers along the vine that look like miniature potatoes. They're about like a quarter of an inch to half an inch in diameter. And it also produces a large underground tuber, which can be harvested every couple of years. Both the little tiny tubers that grow along the vine and the big tuber underground can be eaten raw, but they're better cooked. And it's like a potato, but starchier.
I've had it raw, just the yam berries, and I found that they tasted a little mucilaginous. I'm not sure if that sticks with it when it's cooked, but I assume.
So they actually are. The yam berries and the whole root are mucilaginous, and it's traditional use in Japanese cuisine. One of the things they do is they'll put it through like a zester almost, and they'll make like a little. They take advantage of the mucilaginous part of it by like shredding it and then putting it on top of rice with soy sauce. And so the starchy mucilaginous part of the yam absorbs the soy sauce very quickly and takes on the flavor.
Oh, that's interesting. I've grown them before and cooked them just very plainly, but I didn't know about the food culture behind it and some of the other uses that they use when preparing it. And I guess that goes to show why it's nice to understand the history and the place of origin of the plants we grow to get, for no other reason than just to get good ideas on how to use them. And so one thing I've always considered with this genus of plants is that if you look up some Dioscorea yamberry species, there's some warnings about toxicity. It sounds like in this species that's not really an issue, but there are some other species, I think maybe Bulbifera and Alata. Are you able to clear up any of the confusion there in terms of the toxicity of these sort of aerial yam vines?
Well, so this species is one of the hardy species. The toxic species tend to be tropical, but yeah, the taxonomy of the species is not really well defined. Like even this species has a couple different names. It's Dioscorea polystachya, it's Dioscorea batatas. I think there's one other name too. I want to say there's some rule about like, I don't know if it's the edible species have either opposite leaves or alternate leaves, and then the poisonous ones are the opposite, but I couldn't tell you off the top of my
Yeah, me
head.
neither. But is it the case that if it's the cold hardy species, you do have the polystachya and
A lot of the species, I mean, as far as I know, the other temperate species do not produce the aerial tubers. Like we even have our own native species, which does not do that. And it's only used for medicinal purposes and stuff. I mean, I would just say get your plant from a reliable source.
sure.
And just to sort of qualify what exactly the cold hardiness range is of what we're discussing here, zone 6, zone 5.
Zone 5.
Yeah, I've never observed it in zone 4 before, but who knows. And batatas these plants do sort of escape the lab. I've observed them outside of a garden setting. And then once you get into the common name for the one that's a little bit of a warmer species, when you start moving south in the eastern United States, is just air potato. And that one, I believe, is classified as an exotic invasive in some places. But if you're in zone 5, air potato is not going to be what you're growing. I'm pretty sure that one is also edible, though. That's something that has been proposed as sort of a vining species of food forests in the past.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. Like maybe I was getting my wires crossed, thinking that I was seeing, warnings against planting these maybe that the air potato species because it was an invasive, but maybe not because it had toxicity, and it was one of the other species that had some toxicity. But just to take a step back and reiterate what Kyle was saying, these are starchy, easy to harvest, easy to grow, productive vines, and I mean I can't think of anything else like that in the world. A vine that produces starch in abundance too. So if it's something that you can contain in a reasonable way, like Mike, you were saying, that does escape the lab. I've noticed that in my garden too. They just seem to pop up all over the place. But it's a really valuable plant, I think.
I would say don't plant it on top of a hill because all the little tubers roll down the hill and then they make new plants. It's best to have like a small edging around it just to keep them from rolling away.
How do you prepare them in a way that is tasty? I've never sauteed them. I've never grilled them up. I'm sure that you have some way of preparing them that is much more advanced than Ben or I.
The best thing to do is just to like pan fry them in some butter or oil with some seasoning. The issue with them is that they have more skin. With a larger potato, there's less skin to starch. While where with these, because they're so small, there's more skin, and they have almost a popping texture when they're cooked well, where like it's when you bite into them, it almost tastes like eating a grain at that point because it's just like about that size of like a very large grain. But I've had a great experience harvesting the below ground tuber too, which I would recommend every 3 years or so. And you can harvest those in rotation. So like start another plant from a tuber and then harvest the underground tuber of a different plant and then like alternate. The underground tuber is known as nagaimo in Japan, and they grow them like 2 feet long using these special underground plastic tubes to keep them straight. It's really tasty when cooked right. Like I made a traditional Japanese street food where you basically chop it into 1 inch segments and then fry it in some soy sauce and just olive oil. It was delicious. Like all of the starchiness of a potato, but like with a kind of burnt soy sauce flavor on the outside. It was very good.
Wow.
I've heard it called, a starvation food or something, but that's probably just because people didn't know how to prepare it properly.
If you go into a Japanese or an Asian market, you'll probably see it being sold as nagaimo, and you probably won't recognize it because it's like 2 feet long. All right, so the next one I'm going to talk about is Ligularia fisheri, or Fisher's ragwort. And this is a large-leaved clumping perennial in the aster family, and it has a very large distribution across Eastern Asia. The leaves are edible raw or cooked and are actually commercially grown in greenhouses in South Korea. They use the raw leaf as a wrap to like put some cooked meat or something inside of it and then eat the whole thing with the wrap. And they also cook the leaf as like a vegetable side dish. The flavor, this is the hardest one for me to describe flavor-wise because it's described as tasting like chrysanthemum, but like most people don't have any reference to that. It has like a very herbal flavor, but it's not bitter. Or I should say it's usually not bitter. If you harvest it too late or if the soil is too dry, it can get bitter. But what's particularly special about this plant is it's a perennial with raw edible leaves, which is pretty uncommon, especially in colder zones, and this can be grown down to zone 5.
And it's also called gomchi. Come on, we need the the common name.
Oh, yeah.
And so for anyone who's listening, gomchi is something that you can pick up from Kitazawa Seed, which is a company that I've ordered from in the past. One Green World, if you're on the West Coast, carries this, I think, as something that you can buy in a 1-gallon pot or larger. Although shipping to the East Coast is pretty expensive, which I've has kept me from ordering from One Green World. But yeah, gomchi, it's spelled a bunch of different ways, also known as Fisher's ragwort. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't really have a common name. That's just like Ligularia is a ragwort, and this one is named after Fisher, so it's Fisher's ragwort.
It has some bright, kind of scraggly looking flowers. Still looks like it might attract some pollinators. Have you noticed pollinators? Well, I'm sure you have, but maybe this one or any of the other plants you've talked about. Have you noticed any of your wildlife or kind of ecosystem participating?
Well, this plant in particular, it starting about now in late June, it's starting to send up its flower stalk, and it sends up like 4 to 6 foot tall flower stalk, and then it flowers, I would say, in the fall. So it's a fall flowering plant, or late summer, early fall. And it's really quite impressive. It's got all these little yellow flowers on a tall stalk, and it's I think it's a good late bee forage type of plant. I mean, there are other asters that flower in the fall, but this one is edible. So it does do double duty in that regard.
Something we should maybe mention is just the sort of shade tolerance of this plant. I mean, I don't know if it flowers in the shade, but in terms of something that you can plant in part or full shade and still expect a harvest from, I think it's pretty unique in that regard.
Yeah, so I grow mine on the north side of my house, like right up against the house. I mean, it gets some sun in the end of the day. The big thing to know about this plant, it likes moisture. You can grow it in full sun in consistently wet soil, but you cannot grow it in full sun in dry soil. So like the more moisture it has, the more sun it can tolerate. It grows wild along mountain streams in like sunny clearings. So that's kind of the environment you want to create for it if possible.
Very good to know.
Last couple notes I have for this species is you want to make sure that you have the correct species, Ligularia fisheri, because some of the other species contain alkaloids, which are like toxic to the liver over time. So like this one is known to be safe and it's widely eaten and cultivated, but don't just go eating any Ligularia plant that you see.
Yeah, so I guess that would come back to sort of sourcing it from somewhere that has it. Kitazawa seed in California has carried it for several years, which if anyone's listening and they want to grow it from seed, they can get it from there.
So the next plant is Hovinia dulcis, the Japanese raisin tree. It's a deciduous tree, which typically grows about 30 feet tall. It has an upright oval habit, and it has shiny linden-like leaves and branches which sort of undulate as they go up. It's kind of an unusual trait. It produces unusual fruits in the fall that are, I don't know how to describe them really. I would recommend for this one, Google a picture of Japanese raisin tree fruits.
If I could describe them in any way, the shape of some sort of weird like gang sign or branding thing, like if you're like ZZ Top and you're like, oh, I want like a new like logo, they're like, oh, here's Hovinia dulcis, like, oh look.
Mike, the gang sign is very accurate. I just looked up a photo. That's really funny that's what you're liking it to. Yeah, I don't know how to describe it, but it's very unique.
But then it ends up tasting delicious.
Yes. So the fruit, the part that you eat is not actually the fruit. It's actually the stalk of the fruit, which becomes fleshy and delicious. The actual fruit is this little tiny black capsule, like on the end of each little stick, which you just throw out because it doesn't taste good. When you eat these fresh, they taste kind of like a pear or a persimmon. They're astringent until they're fully ripe. But they like the second you put it in your mouth, you're like, wow, this is really sweet. But after you dry them, that's where the name Japanese raisin tree comes in, because they're chewy and they taste sweet like raisins, but they have like a more complex flavor, almost like a date. They're produced very, very readily along the whole plant. And they also are known to have medicinal properties. Actually, they've actually been researched because they can cure hangovers because of some very specific compounds that are only in this tree.
Whoa, now, okay, I'm much more interested. And this another thing to comment for plant nerds out there who might have read Michael Durr. Michael Durr has a lot of like really strong opinions about plants. Really likes this one. He comments that they're very tasty, which is remarkable, I guess, to say. And Kyle, there's also a raisin tree that is native that is sort of similar taste to this. Is that correct?
Well, there's a viburnum that's called raisin tree, but frankly, I haven't had a viburnum fruit that I've liked yet.
That's true. I mean, I agree with you. Well, okay, the cranberry viburnum, which I guess this should be its own episode, but about native plants and not East Asian plants. But anyways, yeah.
We'll do that one next.
Yeah. Okay, so sorry, back to the Japanese raisin tree.
This tree is hardy down to zone 5, which is extremely unusual because it's a subtropical plant. Its distribution is in southern Japan, in Korea. It's actually an invasive plant in the Brazilian rainforest, but you can grow it in Massachusetts. It needs protection for the first couple years in cold climates, but if you're somewhere like California, this tree would be very, very happy.
If only there was someone who was in California.
Zone 9 over here. And Kyle, so do you need are you fine with just one tree producing the fruit? I know you're saying it's the stem that the fruit is on that you're eating, but does it need a pollination partner, or is it?
It's self-fertile, so it's good on its own.
Great.
And before you asked me about pollinator plants, and this plant is really incredible in that regard. Like, it produces like a copious number of these tiny white flowers, which eventually become the fruits in the fruit stalks in about July. And they're extremely fragrant, and the bees come out of the woodwork to see what the heck this plant is. Like, it's just buzzing with all sorts of insects when it's in flower.
Oh man, the bees that are around your property must be the most cultured, like well-fed bees, because they are able to probably taste and smell all sorts of strange pollen that they wouldn't be able to try anywhere else. I always wonder what that's like to be a bee, and to do different plants taste different? Does the nectar of different plants? I would imagine it does. I imagine it's not just a quantity thing; it's also the quality of it. And yeah, I wish I could smell those raisin tree flowers and see what they're like.
Yeah, they're very, very fragrant. Like, I always try to pick any plant that I put in my yard has to have some kind of ornamental quality. So like when I smelled these flowers and I saw it in bloom, I was like, yes, this passes the test.
Bees who are checking out the Sichuan pepper vibe, the raisin tree vibe, the native plants. It's all happening over there. Is there anything else you want to talk about for the raisin tree, or should we move on?
Let's move on to the next one. The next one, Pseudocydonia sinensis, which is the Chinese quince. This is an upright deciduous tree from East Asia that typically grows about 15 feet tall. It's a relative of the true quince, which is Cydonia oblonga, but it has a few differences. So the fruit is larger and harder than a normal quince, and it has less of that floral flavor and scent that quince is so known for. But the tree has this incredible exfoliating bark, which I personally think is the best of any fruit tree out there. And the bark, like, it peels off like a Koza dogwood, but it also changes colors. So in the spring, it's orange, and then like later in the year, it transitions to white. So you get like this color gradient effect. It has attractive pink flowers. It's hardy in probably zone 6B and up, so this is a warmer one.
Let's not forget that this is like the fruiting tree in zone 6B that is producing fruits that are the size of a papaya. I mean, Ben, and I stumbled upon this tree with these fruits that were bigger than the size of our head. Like, that is really unique to find in a cold climate.
Yeah, I remember we were in Connecticut driving to the Lockwood Farms, and we passed one of these trees, and I was shook when I saw that like papaya-sized fruit growing in Connecticut. And this was, I can't remember exactly. I think it was December or sometime. It was pretty cold out too, where where not a lot of things were growing, all of a sudden seeing this like tropical looking fruit was striking. And sure enough, there were some that I think that got hit by the frost, but there were some that were fine, and I was able to bring them back to my parents' house and cooked it up like you would other quince species.
Yeah, and so the biggest one I measured last year was 7 inches long and 4 inches wide for some specific measurements, right? And it can be used just like a normal quince, but the flavor is a little bit.
It's not as floral. It's a little bit more mild. It's kind of like a mix in with a stew rather than like a dessert kind of vibe.
Yeah, I'll trust you guys on that. I haven't actually cooked the like a true quince before, but I did notice what you mentioned about how it didn't have the same fragrance.
I was thinking about it, and I think the reason for this is because all of the quinces we grow are selected varieties, while all of the Chinese quinces we grow are seedlings. So, this is a tree which has had no selection in the West.
True.
And so like the trees that we're growing here are not, the best fruiting selections that they grow in Korea, which we just don't have access to.
We just need to plant 10,000 seedlings in an orchard, and then we'll walk from tree to tree and smell each fruit and pick the most fragrant ones and breed those.
So the man who pioneered that, Luther Burbank, right, in California, in Sebastopol, he actually planted a row of Chinese quince at his experimental farm, and it's still there to this day.
I think maybe I need to take a field trip.
Yeah, if you're within the area. I don't know if he ever decided to do any selection work on it, but I mean, who knows? The fruit on those trees could be pretty good fruit.
Basically, what you're saying is that like nobody has ever taken Chinese quince and improved it whatsoever. It's entirely just considered an ornamental without any sort of edible qualities.
Well, I'm sure they've improved it in Asia, because they do harvest the fruit and they do prize it. But I don't think any of those have made it into the United States, for instance. So what we're getting is just whatever seed some plant explorer collected from a tree that they found
200 years ago. Yeah. It's like the same way that there are sea berry cultivars in Russia that are super choice that just don't exist in the US. And all these plant nerds and permaculture nerds in the US love sea berry, and just we'll never know. We'll never know what it tastes like in a different place.
So if you're in zone 6B and up, plant one, and then we'll find out what it tastes like, and we'll find some better ones. So the next one on the list is Cephalotaxis, or the plum yews. Now, I'm not putting a specific species here because there are 7 species, and they're all pretty interchangeable from an edible perspective. They're slow-growing evergreen conifers. They're kind of like yews, but with longer needles. And they all produce an edible berry with a single large seed and a tasty, juicy pulp. So this one, I know Mike's heard me talk about this one for 2 years now. This plant is interesting because, it's an evergreen and it fruits very well in full shade. So, if you want a evergreen hedge in full shade and you also want some fruit, this is a good plant for that. The flesh of the fruit is juicy, it's aromatic. It ranges in flavor depending on the individual plant and species, from ripe American persimmon to one of those artificial strawberry flavored candies. And they also have a little hint of pine sap. It's really very difficult to describe from a flavor perspective. The most common species is Cephalotaxis harringtonia, which is the Japanese plum yew. And these grow maybe 10 to 12 feet tall, but they grow very slowly. So you can just trim them back and keep them whatever size you want.
And so these are most closely related to the yew species that we all grew up with. But in reality, it's an entirely different plant. It's a tree that has been ignored by seemingly every culture in terms of its edible properties. Is that correct?
Well, it's popular among foragers, but it's not something where you're going to go and harvest 10 pounds of them and make something. It's more it just has this really unusual tropical sort of flavor. And it's in its own genus, actually, separate from the yews. And the seeds are technically edible on this. Like, they're not going to be poisoned if you accidentally swallow one of these seeds. They just don't taste good. But some other important things to know about this species. The species is dioecious, so you need females and males to get fruit. And like, this is honestly the biggest hurdle to growing this plant. You basically just have to grow a handful of seedlings, which is fine if you want like a hedge. But all of the plants in cultivation, all the cultivars are sterile. So you can't just go buy a cultivar one. You have to basically plant seeds. And it takes a few years before they actually start to produce their flowers.
That's really interesting that all of the cultivars are sterile. That's kind of like the way that ginkgos are almost always male in cultivation.
Yeah, I mean, the production of fruit is usually considered a bad thing because it makes a mess.
Urban planners who are considering how much litter they're going to have to sweep up on their streets, I guess. And yeah,
Yeah,
things we need to address and change in our society.
yeah, of
And the
course.
fruits are typically
So-
eaten out of hand, just fresh and foraged, or are they ever dried or?
So, yeah, they're eaten fresh out of hand. They're also used to make a liquor where basically you submerge the fruit into, say, vodka or something, and it takes on the unique sweet flavor of the fruit. The native people in Japan that I knew actually heavily utilized this plant, and they did kind of strange things with it. Like, they would take the skin of the fruit, just the skin, and they would grind it up and use it as a spice. But yeah, they're very juicy, so they don't have a very long shelf life. So, I mentioned Cephalotaxis harringtonia, which is the Japanese species. There's two others that are kind of good to mention. There's Cephalotaxis nana, which is like a dwarf version that also grows in Japan. And this one only gets to 6 feet tall. So it's kind of like an ideal size for an understory, if you ask me. And the fruit of that species is actually sweeter than the other species, but it's very difficult to find in cultivation. And then there's another species, Cephalotaxis fortunae, which is like a tree. It grows up to 25 feet tall, and it has the biggest fruit, but they're not as sweet. And the needles are about 4 inches long, so it has this incredible ornamental look to it.
Is that the one that's most commonly found in terms of, ornamental cultivation, or in Martha's Vineyard, the botanical garden that you visited? Would you say that one was more cultivated there than others?
The most common one is Harringtonia, which is kind of just has I don't know, in my opinion, kind of plain looking needles. Usually if a botanical garden has like a collection, like the Arnold Arboretum or the Polly Hill Arboretum in Martha's Vineyard, they both have collections where they have basically every species that's hardy in their zone, which is most of them. They're all basically hardy to 5B, but they can they can dry out a little bit in the winter if they're in too much sun. They're very popular. The cultivars are very popular ornamentals in the South because they look like yews, but they tolerate the heat better because they come from a warmer place.
And if I were to order a small, maybe 1 or 2 year old plum yew plant, how long would it take, do you think, to see fruit from that, or appreciable fruit? Assuming too that I buy multiple.
Yeah, so I would say it's probably 5 years from seed, and then I don't know if you had one that was already 2 years old, then maybe 3 years. It's pretty finicky, and I would say this is a plant for people who are very exploratory, like they want to try some strange fruits.
That's not too bad, though.
If you go on the Weird Fruit Explorers channel on YouTube, he has a taste review of Japanese plum yew where he kind of gives a good assessment of it. But yeah, the biggest takeaway is if you want fruit, don't buy a named cultivar because it will never fruit. You just order seeds from a reputable nursery and you have to kind of wait.
Yeah, that's a great tip. The Weird Explorer channel is a wonderful way to like experience the tasting of new fruits without actually having them in front of you. He does a good job explaining them.
Yeah, you get some idea if they're worth growing or whatnot. So second to last one here, Xanthoxylum simulans, which is flat spine prickly ash, also known as Szechuan pepper. So this is a large shrub or small tree from eastern China, which grows about 15 feet tall. It has these really interesting flat spines along the branches, hence the name flat spine prickly ash, and the spines turn into these big knobs on older specimens, so it looks like the trunk is all bumpy. And it's a source of Szechuan pepper, which is a very popular spice in Asia. It's kind of hard to describe the flavor. It's spicy, it's got a little citrus, but it also has this tingly, numbing effect. And you can buy it dried in Asian markets all over the country. The part that the spice comes from is actually the husk of the fruit, which opens up to like release the seeds in the fall. So you can pick them green before they open and dry them, or you could pick them red after they open and dry them, and they have slightly different taste profiles. Do you remember when I had you guys try this?
Yeah, it was very surprising because I think when I've heard Szechuan pepper, I just assume it's something that's just all about heat. So it's surprising that the flavor was more of like a mouth tingle, maybe slightly reminiscent of the toothache plant or kava that kind of numbs your mouth or makes your mouth tingle. And then also the fact that it wasn't the fruit itself, it was the husk around the fruit, I thought was really interesting because we don't really have a lot of herbs or spices or fruits that we're eating just the husk of. So yeah, that was really interesting. And I think both Mike and I thought it had a bit of a coppery type of flavor to, or like a bit of metallic flavor to it. So I'm interested to see like how that gets incorporated, how this spice is incorporated into cuisine because I've never cooked with it before.
Yeah, so they typically will roast or dry it and then like grind it up, which I have not tried yet. But I think that what that does is it kind of removes some of the worst elements of like the tingling, but it also, because it's a powder, you can kind of control the amount that you put in a little bit better than just like a handful of husks or something.
I have to interject here and say that since that experience where we had the, I don't know, sampling, I have gone to some very authentic Chinese restaurants recommended by my
Hmm.
friends who are Chinese themselves and said like, oh, don't go to these places, they're Americanized or whatever, and just go to these spots. And then the Sichuan flavor really resonates where that, like, let's say you're having beef or chicken or whatever, like at a certain point it is like the mouthfeel, and it pulled me back and I was like, holy crap, like this is the same feeling that I had in Kyle's kitchen. And it's not like heat, it's the mouthfeel experience while you're eating it, and it's like so addicting to me now, and I've just become completely attached to that mouth sensation of like true Szechuan cooking.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about how it grows.
It's a small tree or large shrub. It's typically multi-stemmed. It likes to grow in full sun to part shade, and I would say 5B, zone 5B plus. So the reason I'm recommending Xanthoxylum simulans, this specific species, is that this one is self-fertile. A lot of the other Xanthoxylum species, and there's several of them, they're all basically used as a source of Szechuan pepper, but a lot of them are dioecious, so you need male and female plants to get the fruits, which you want. But Xanthoxylum simulans is like reliably self-fertile to the point where it will produce hundreds of fruit easily on one plant. And it's also one of the hardiest down to 5B, whereas a lot of the others are maybe zone 7 or even higher sometimes.
It's the one that makes the magic.
Yeah, it's definitely the one I would recommend. And like what Ben was saying about kind of like it's very rare that we grow quote unquote spice plants in temperate climates. Like most of the spices come from like some tropical far off land, and they're like, shipped to you and you never know what the plant looks like. So I think Szechuan pepper is a really interesting case where you can grow a spice in your yard that is very widely used and appreciated. As Mike kind of pointed out, it's pretty good once you like know how to use it. And yeah, it's just a really interesting plant for colder climates.
Similar to pine nuts, like it seems like the pine nuts that people have when they, grind them into pesto are not the Italian pine nuts. They're actually the Korean kind, which are hardy
This
to,
is true.
Kyle, you recently visited an arboretum where they have a Korean pine. Am I wrong?
You're correct. I visited Hortus Arboretums in upstate New York, and they basically specialize in edible plants. Honestly, their collection was, I would describe it as dizzying.
It's just crazy to think that, the pine nuts that we buy at our local grocery store theoretically could be produced en masse in cold hardy zones. Like that could be
Yeah.
something that we could do.
Yeah. And, if we're going to have a quick aside about pine nuts, I would recommend buying grafted cultivar Korean pines because they will produce nuts way, way faster than a seedling will. Like a seedling might take you 20 years to get nuts, but if you buy just some grafted ornamental Korean pine, it will produce nuts pretty shortly.
And is that something that you could just purchase at, your local nursery for whatever ornamental, or is it?
Well, you'd have to do a little research, but there's a cultivar Silver Ray, which has nice silver foliage and it's shorter. And that's one that's good because, you can reach the cones because it's a shorter cultivar and it's going to produce the cones faster because it's grafted. And then you would just have to get one of the other cultivars as like a pollinator. But I have not prepared a speech about Korean pine nuts. All right, so this is the last one and also the weirdest one. And if you try to locate one of these plants, it will be difficult. Helwingia japonica. This is the Japanese Helwingia. It's a deciduous multi-stem shrub that grows between 4 and 6 feet tall, and it likes to grow in moist shade. And this plant has young leaves that are edible cooked, and they have like a mild spinach flavor. The leaves are pretty thick, but they're also still tender, and they stand up really well to cooking. The Japanese like to use them in tempura because they're thick, so they hold up to the frying process very well. The thing that makes this plant unusual is that the flowers of the plant come out of the center of the leaves, and the Japanese name is actually Hana Ikata, which means flower raft, because it looks like a flower sitting on a raft.
Yeah, I'm looking up some photos right now, and I haven't seen anything like this before. It's so unique.
Yeah, I can't really think of another plant where the flower actually comes out of the leaf. There's some plants where the leaf wraps around the flower, but this one, like the flower stem is actually fused into the center of the leaf. And so the other interesting characteristic of this plant is that it produces an edible black berry in the center of the leaf where the flower is. So it looks like basically a marble sitting on top of a leaf. I have not tried the berry, but I have eaten leaves. And the leaves are good. And honestly, like they're very mild. And so they could be used in bulk if you planted a bunch of plants. And you would have to plant a bunch of plants because it's dioecious, it's male and female. So if you want some berries, you have to get some male and female plants. So that's the reason I haven't tasted the berry yet. I only have a male plant currently, and I'm trying to find a female one.
Podcast listeners, if you have access to this Asian greens vegetable, please reach out to us. Kyle Dougherty is in need.
Lonely Helwingias in your area.
Kyle, where do you go to look for some of your hard to find plants? Like, what is your process when you're trying to track something down?
Well, so this plant in particular, there's 2 good nurseries that sell it. Far Reaches Farm sells a male clone, which is where I got mine. And I forget what the other nursery is now. There's another nursery in Oregon that sells them. This one I would love to grow from seed, but I couldn't get any seed anywhere. Mainly it's just Googling and asking around. And well, so the Arnold Arboretum has a nice patch of this plant. That's how I can say it's hardy to zone 5B. And that's where I've tasted the leaves because my plant is fairly young. But it is a full shade plant. Mine got leaf scorch from like part sun, like late day sun. It's just an interesting leaf crop because it's mild. Japanese foragers love this plant because they can pick a lot of it and it doesn't have any kind of bitterness that they have to deal with. And I really would say it's very spinach-like. It has a little bit of oxalic acid, so it has that slight lemony thing, but that goes away in cooking. And the berry is very interesting, and I hope to one day try it.
Something that in the United States, especially, we undervalue is shade, and how, same thing with gumchi, Lagaria fischeri. There are vegetables that you can produce in shade, in full shade. And this sounds like one that is the best of the bunch, like we didn't talk about fuki on this episode, maybe for a reason. And, like that one was not mentioned, and that's okay, perhaps. But, there's lots of other options that don't have as many toxicity issues and are really delicious, apparently. And I'm really excited for the next time I visit you and get to try some of this.
My secret stash. A lot of my plants are fairly young, and I've tasted them, tasted older specimens in arboretums and whatnot. So we'll get there. And that's the last one. So that's 10 unusual edible plants from East Asia.
Kyle, before we clock off, maybe for people who haven't heard of anything that we've talked about today, do you want to just drop some knowledge, like a few places that maybe you started off with finding some of the seeds, or places that you could source some of these plants? We mentioned One Green World has Gomchi and Kitazawa Seed Company, but anywhere else that, might stock anything that we've mentioned today for someone who just wants to click an order?
Yeah, so I'll break this into two parts. For anyone who wants to research Asian edible plants, you can use Google Chrome now to translate Japanese or Chinese or any language websites into English. And I've honestly learned a lot from just, say, watching Japanese YouTube videos and reading Japanese Wikipedia entries where they talk about all the edible uses. And then you look at the English one and it has one sentence, So there's a lot of information out there now that, we have internet translation tools. So I would encourage people to do some of their own exploration. And then when it comes to sourcing plants, I mean, I could even go down the list, like Tuna sinensis. There's a couple nurseries in the US that sell the variety Flamingo. The Bumald's blatternut, Staphylia bumalda. The only way to really get that right now is to get seeds. It's in some botanical gardens around, but there's also some websites that sell seeds maybe once a year. But you could also try eating some other bladdernuts that, are around, or other species. The Japanese certainly seem to think that all of them are edible, and I tend to agree with them. I mentioned the five-leaf Aurelia. The variegated form is actually a pretty popular shade-tolerant shrub. So if you only get one, the variegated form is very attractive to grow. We talked about the Fisher's ragwort. One Green World has them, and Kitazawa Seed. I'm not sure who's selling the Chinese yam these days, because I've had my plant for like 5 years. Japanese raisin tree you can buy it from Just Fruits and Exotics in Florida. They will ship anywhere, but I would, Edgewood Nursery in Maine, I believe Aaron is growing some seed out as a trial. And you would think, like, Edgewood Nursery in Maine is growing this subtropical tree, but crazier things have happened. Chinese quince sold by Forest Farm and One Green World occasionally. Plum yews need to be grown from seed. I would recommend, the heck is that seed company in Massachusetts? Sandwich, Massachusetts.
JL Hudson.
JL Hudson. They sell Cephalotaxis Fortunae, which is the one with longer needles, and they sell, I believe, Harringtonia, which is the more common one. Both are good. The Szechuan pepper, I would recommend Rain Tree Nursery. They sell it. Their plants are excellent quality. Can't recommend them enough. And then if you're looking for, Japanese Helwinia, like I said, Far Reaches Farm, pretty good. So, there are sources out there for rare and unusual plants like these. It may cost you a little bit, Or you could hit up your local arboretum in the fall and collect seeds, which I've gotten a lot of mileage out of.
I'm a total advocate of your arboreta being your local library. So to those of us who are plant nerds, somebody 200 years ago brought all these seeds here, hoping that other plant nerds would come and harvest these seeds and plant them afar and wide. So more power to you if that's what you want to do.
This was fascinating. Before we wrap up, Kyle, is there anything that you want our listeners to know, especially the ones that made it to the end, the real diehards, or anything that you want to you'd like them to connect with on social media, or a place that they can go to get great information? It doesn't have to be from you, just maybe.
I mean, I would just say grow some of these plants so that I'm not the only one growing them. And we could trade notes. You could find me on Facebook, Kyle Dougherty, and I'll be the one with the profile picture of me standing in a tree. But yeah, I would just encourage people to explore and try some of these more out there plants, because I feel like a lot of them are pretty worthwhile.
Well, thank you, Kyle, for joining us. And to our listeners, those of you that have stuck this whole hour and 11 minutes plus with us, we really value, you as listeners, and apologize for our slight delay in release schedules. Our Ben and myself, our schedules have been a little crazy lately, as is life. And you can always check us out on our Instagram at Forest Garden Podcast. Kyle, it has been awesome to host you, and I hope that we get to have you come back soon. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and see you next time.